Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories.
The First World War in the Middle East ended in 1918, but the end of one war was just the beginning of another. In the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, peace didn't arrive like sunrise. It arrived like occupation, with boots on cobblestones and foreign flags over harbors. And in that narrow space between surrender and settlement, whole nations began to imagine that history could be rewritten in their favor, as if the war had opened a door to the past. In late October 1918, the Armistice of Mudros ended the fighting between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire, but lasting peace was still a long way off in Asia Minor. British, French, and Italian troops occupied much of the empire, including the imperial capital of Constantinople, the seat of the now powerless Sultan Mehmed VI's government. The Sultan still sat on the throne, but his authority felt like a shadow, present in name, hollow in practice, watched by foreign soldiers who treated the city as a prize already won. As the Allied governments discussed a future peace treaty in Paris in 1919, their differences were clear for all to see. The French wanted to secure their financial interests and their new mandates in Syria and Lebanon. The Italians wanted to extend their influence into Asia Minor, and the British hoped to keep their First World War gains and secure the eastern Mediterranean route to British India. The United States had no appetite for involvement beyond sending humanitarian aid, despite President Wilson's hopes, leaving the region to be bargained over by exhausted empires that still thought in terms of spheres, ports, and lines on maps. For Greece, however, this wasn't only about strategy. It was about identity, memory, and a promise whispered for generations. The Greek government, led by Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, saw the defeat of the Ottomans as a historic chance to gain territory and achieve at least some version of a greater Greece, the Megali idea. In their imagination, the war had not ended at Mudros. It had simply cleared the stage for a national destiny, one that seemed suddenly possible because the old empire was bleeding and the new peace was being drafted far away. In May 1919, at the invitation of the Allies, Greek troops landed at the city of Smyrna and occupied a zone in western Asia Minor. In light of the terrible violence and ethnic cleansing between Greeks and Turks during the Balkan Wars and the First World War, the move was a controversial one, including for the British General Staff, which warned that Greek occupation would create continual unrest and might culminate in an organized Turkish attempt to reconquer the territory. The warning was not abstract. It was the voice of men who had seen what happens when armies arrive in places where civilians still remember the last massacre, the last expulsion, the last burned village. The very first day of the Greek landings at Smyrna, Greek troops failed to establish full control, and the resulting violence saw several hundred Turks killed. That first blood mattered, because it changed the meaning of the occupation overnight. What was presented as an orderly transfer became, in local memory, an assault. And memory in this land was not passive. It was fuel. In the months that followed, atrocities committed by occupying Greek troops helped drive local Turks into irregular resistance groups, and the spiral began. Attacks, reprisals, fear, and the hardening certainty on both sides that survival required victory. This marked the beginning of the Greco-Turkish War, known as the Asia Minor Campaign in Greece and the Turkish War of Liberation in Turkey. And from the start, it was more than a clash of armies. It was a struggle over what the post-war world would allow to exist, a resurrected Greater Greece or a new Turkish state born from the humiliation of occupation. And while the Greek army established itself around Smyrna, deeper in Anatolia, something else was awakening, an organized nationalist movement that would soon make the peace table in Paris feel very far away. While Greek troops consolidated their foothold around Smyrna, the wider landscape of Asia Minor was already fractured by competing foreign ambitions. British, French, and Italian soldiers occupied ports, railways, and cities, not as partners in a shared vision, but as rivals quietly measuring how much each could extract from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. To the people living under occupation, the uniforms were different, but the message felt the same. The future of their land was being decided elsewhere. In Constantinople, Allied troops patrolled streets that had once been the nerve center of imperial rule. The Sultan's government still existed, but it functioned under the watchful eyes of foreign officers, its authority shrinking by the day. Decisions that once radiated outward from the palace now waited on approval from Allied commands, turning the Ottoman state into a hollow shell, symbolically alive, politically paralyzed. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, this paralysis translated into confusion rather than clarity. The Allies agreed on one thing only: the Ottoman Empire had lost the war and could not be allowed to recover. Beyond that, unity collapsed. France focused on securing financial concessions and legitimizing its mandates in Syria and Lebanon, while Italy pressed claims to influence in southwestern Anatolia as compensation for its wartime sacrifices. Britain, still thinking in imperial terms, cared most about controlling the straits and safeguarding the sea routes that connected the Mediterranean to India. The United States, despite President Wilson's rhetoric about self-determination, kept its distance. American delegates listened, advised, and sent aid, but they had no appetite for enforcing settlements with troops. That absence mattered. Without American power behind it, Wilsonian idealism became a language spoken at conferences rather than a force shaping realities on the ground. As weeks turned into months, the lack of a coherent Allied strategy created a vacuum. Each occupying force pursued its own interests, sometimes overlapping, sometimes colliding. Reports of violence around Smyrna unsettled British officers, while French and Italian diplomats worried that Greek expansion might destabilize regions they hoped to influence. The peace that was supposed to end the Great War was already undermining itself. For many Turks, this disarray was revealing. The occupiers did not look like confident architects of a new order. They looked like divided heirs arguing over an inheritance. The longer the Allies debated and delayed, the clearer it became that no single power was willing or able to impose a settlement by force. In that growing gap between ambition and action, resistance found room to breathe, and the idea of fighting back no longer seemed unthinkable. For Eleftherios Venizelos, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire felt like a moment history had been preparing for generations. Greece had emerged from the First World War on the victorious side, its army intact, its leader respected in Allied capitals, and its ambitions suddenly aligned with the chaos unfolding across the Aegean. Venizelos believed that rare windows in history opened only briefly, and that this one, born from Ottoman defeat and Allied uncertainty, could not be missed. At the heart of his vision was the Megali idea, a nationalist dream rooted in the memory of Byzantium and the belief that Greece had a historic right to reclaim lands where Greek communities had lived for centuries. Smyrna, with its large Greek population, prosperous port, and cultural prestige, stood at the center of that dream. To Venizelos and his supporters, occupying Smyrna was not conquest, but redemption, a correction of history rather than its violation. Venizelos was also a realist. He understood that ideals alone would not redraw borders, and that Greece's claims depended on Allied approval. At Paris, he presented Greece as a stabilizing force in the eastern Mediterranean, a Christian nation capable of governing territories that the Ottomans had misruled. In private, he reassured British officials that Greek administration would be orderly and restrained, a safer alternative to Italian or French expansion. For a moment, his arguments worked. But the Megali idea carried risks that were easy to underestimate from conference rooms. It assumed that ethnicity could be neatly translated into borders, that populations scarred by years of war and displacement would accept new rulers peacefully. It also assumed that Turkish resistance would remain fragmented and weak. These assumptions were fragile, and each depended on conditions far beyond Athens's control. Within Greece itself, the vision was not universally embraced. Years of war had strained the economy, and the army's long deployment abroad worried officers who understood the limits of manpower and logistics. Still, Venizelos pressed forward, convinced that delay would be fatal. If Greece hesitated, another power would step in, or the opportunity would vanish entirely. By choosing action over caution, Venizelos bound Greece's fate to events unfolding deep in Anatolia. What began as a calculated advance toward national fulfillment would soon entangle Greece in a war far larger than the dream that inspired it, one that would test not just armies, but the very idea that history could be claimed by force alone. In the early hours of May 15, 1919, Greek troops disembarked at the quays of Smyrna under Allied supervision, stepping into a city already heavy with fear and expectation. To many of Smyrna's Greek inhabitants, the arrival felt like liberation. Church bells rang, flags appeared in windows, and crowds pressed forward to greet soldiers they believed had come to secure their future. But beneath the surface celebration, the city was brittle, shaped by years of war, deportations, and rumors of revenge. From the very first hours, the occupation began to unravel. Greek units failed to establish full control over the city, command structures broke down, and isolated incidents escalated rapidly. Shots were fired, panic spread, and by the end of the day, several hundred Turkish civilians and soldiers lay dead. What was meant to be a carefully managed transfer of authority instead became a violent rupture, searing itself into the memory of the local population. For Turkish residents, the landings confirmed their worst fears. The uniforms were Greek, but the experience felt familiar. Another occupying force backed by distant powers, another moment when survival depended on submission or flight. News of the killings spread quickly through western Anatolia, carried by refugees, merchants, and railway workers, transforming Smyrna from a symbol of Allied order into proof that the post-war settlement would be enforced at gunpoint. Even among the Allies, alarm bells rang. British officers on the ground reported that Greek discipline had collapsed at the crucial moment, and that the occupation risked inflaming exactly the kind of resistance it was meant to prevent. Within days, the British General Staff warned that Greek control of Smyrna could become a source of continual unrest, possibly culminating in an organized Turkish attempt to reconquer the territory. It was a rare moment of clarity, but one that came too late to reverse events already set in motion. In the weeks that followed, violence did not subside. Reports emerged of abuses committed by occupying Greek troops in surrounding villages, fueling anger and fear among Turkish civilians. In response, local resistance groups began to form. Irregular bands with little training but strong motivation, striking Greek soldiers and collaborators before fading back into the countryside. Each attack hardened attitudes on both sides, turning occupation into war by degrees rather than declaration. Smyrna had become more than a city. It was now a wound. The first blood spilled there reshaped the conflict's character, transforming diplomatic maneuvering into a struggle driven by memory, grievance, and the conviction that coexistence was no longer possible. What followed would not be decided solely by conferences or commissions, but by forces gathering far from the coast, where a new Turkish leadership was preparing to answer occupation with resistance. As the Greek occupation settled into the countryside around Smyrna, the violence that had erupted on the first day did not fade, it spread. Villages that had survived the Great War now found themselves caught in a new cycle of fear, as Greek patrols searched for weapons and suspected collaborators. Some operations were routine, others brutal, and the line between military control and collective punishment quickly blurred. For local Turkish communities, each search carried the possibility of humiliation, arrest, or worse. Reports of abuses traveled faster than official communiques. Refugees carried stories of beatings, executions, and burned homes into the interior, where they were repeated, exaggerated, and fused with memories of earlier atrocities from the Balkan Wars and the First World War. In a region already saturated with trauma, these stories did not need to be precise to be effective. They confirmed a belief that the occupation threatened not just territory, but survival itself. In response, Turkish resistance took on an irregular form. Small bands of fighters, often former soldiers, peasants, or local notables, organized themselves into loosely connected groups. Poorly armed but intimately familiar with the terrain, they ambushed Greek patrols, attacked isolated garrisons, and disappeared into hills and forests. These were not armies in the traditional sense, but they did not need to be. Their purpose was to bleed the occupiers and demonstrate that control beyond the cities was an illusion. Greek forces responded with reprisals, convinced that harsh measures were the only way to deter further attacks. Villages suspected of aiding irregulars were punished, sometimes indiscriminately, reinforcing the very resistance the occupation sought to crush. Each act of retaliation justified the next, and the war began to feed on itself, driven less by strategy than by anger and fear. This spiral of violence had a profound political effect. For many Turks who had initially hoped the post-war settlement might preserve some form of autonomy, Smyrna and its aftermath destroyed that illusion. The occupation was no longer a temporary inconvenience to be endured. It was an existential threat that demanded organized resistance. In this atmosphere, neutrality became impossible. To stand aside was to risk being crushed by one side or punished by the other. By late 1919, the conflict had taken on a momentum of its own. What began as a Greek advance sanctioned by the Allies was now a grassroots war shaped by irregular fighters, civilian suffering, and mutual distrust. And while Greek troops struggled to impose order along the coast, far deeper in Anatolia, a different kind of resistance was taking shape, one that would soon transform scattered anger into a national movement with a clear purpose and a single name at its center. While violence spread across western Anatolia, a far more consequential development was unfolding beyond the reach of Greek patrols. In the interior, where Allied influence thinned and Ottoman authority had collapsed into irrelevance, a new political center began to form. For many Turks, the chaos of occupation and the impotence of the Sultan's government made one conclusion unavoidable. If the country were to survive, it would have to save itself. That conviction coalesced around Mustafa Kemal Pasha, a veteran Ottoman officer whose reputation had been forged in the Italo-Turkish War, the Balkan Wars, and the First World War. Kemal was not driven by nostalgia for the empire that had failed. He was driven by a colder ambition, to build a new Turkish state whose sovereignty would be recognized without reservation. In his view, compromise meant extinction, and resistance was no longer optional, but necessary. In 1919, Kemal and other nationalist leaders began organizing politically and militarily, laying the foundations of a parallel authority that rejected the legitimacy of the occupied government in Constantinople. A national assembly emerged, eventually based in Ankara, far from the reach of Allied bayonets. From there, decrees were issued, officers were appointed, and a vision of independence began to take institutional form. What had started as scattered outrage was becoming coordinated defiance. Meanwhile, the Sultan's Grand Vizier, Damad Farid Pasha, pursued a very different strategy. Believing accommodation offered the only hope of preserving what remained of Ottoman sovereignty, he appealed to the Allies in Paris, urging moderation and warning of unrest. His pleas fell on deaf ears. To the Allied powers, Farid's government was weak, compromised, and expendable, useful only as a signature on treaties already drafted. The contrast was stark. In Constantinople, a government waited for permission to exist. In Ankara, a movement prepared to fight for the right to decide its own fate. News of the Smyrna occupation and the growing pattern of atrocities accelerated this shift. Turks who might once have accepted foreign supervision now rallied to the nationalist cause, convinced that only organized resistance could prevent the country from being carved apart. By the end of 1919, two Turkeys existed side by side, one bound by occupation and diplomacy, the other defined by defiance and ambition. The balance between them would soon be decided not in conference halls, but on battlefields, stretching from the Aegean coast deep into the Anatolian heartland. As resistance gathered strength in Anatolia, the Allied powers found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The post-war settlement they were attempting to impose was already unraveling. Reports from Smyrna and the surrounding countryside painted a grim picture: violence, reprisals, and a population sliding toward open rebellion. What had been presented as a stabilizing occupation was increasingly indistinguishable from annexation, and even among the victors of the Great War, unease began to surface. In response, the Allies established an investigative commission to examine conditions in the Greek-occupied zone. Its findings were blunt. The commission concluded that Greek administration around Smyrna closely resembled outright annexation, and that abuses by occupying forces were fueling Turkish resistance rather than suppressing it. The recommendation was clear: the occupation should be brought to an end before it ignited a larger war. On paper, this was a rare moment of Allied self-awareness. In practice, it changed little. Prime Minister Venizelos rejected the Commission's conclusions. He argued that Greece's claims to Smyrna and its hinterland were well known and had been formally presented to the peace conference, insisting that even if Greece was not yet legally entitled to the territory, it was at least morally so. To Venizelos, Withdrawal was unthinkable. It would mean abandoning the Megali idea at the very moment it seemed within reach. The Allies hesitated. Britain, troubled by the reports but unwilling to deploy large forces of its own, wavered. France and Italy, increasingly suspicious of Greek ambitions and preoccupied with their own interests, grew less supportive. Yet none of the powers were prepared to force a reversal on the ground. They lacked both the political will and the troops required to impose their own recommendations. This paralysis sent a powerful signal. To the Greek leadership, it suggested that persistence might eventually harden occupation into acceptance. To Turkish nationalists, it confirmed that the Allies were divided and indecisive, capable of issuing reports but unwilling to enforce consequences. The commission that was meant to cool tensions instead revealed the weakness of the post-war order. By late 1919, diplomacy had become a substitute for action rather than a path to peace. Smyrna remained under Greek control, resentment deepened, and the war drifted further from negotiation toward inevitability. In the vacuum created by Allied confusion, both sides prepared for escalation, convinced that only force, not commissions or conferences, would decide the future of Anatolia. As the situation around Smyrna deteriorated, violence spread far beyond the Greek zone of occupation, exposing how fragile the entire post-war order had become. In southern Anatolia, a separate but equally brutal conflict erupted, drawing in French forces, Armenian units, and Turkish national fighters in a struggle that blurred the line between war and communal vengeance. Towns like Maraş, Urfa, and Antep became battlegrounds where old grievances collided with new ambitions. From January 1920, French and Armenian troops clashed with Turkish nationalist forces in the region. What began as military engagements quickly descended into atrocities against civilians. In Maraş, Turkish fighters murdered around 10,000 Armenians, an act rooted in fear, revenge, and the unresolved trauma of the Armenian genocide only years earlier. Armenian units retaliated in turn, killing smaller numbers of Turkish civilians. Each massacre fed the next, locking the region into a cycle of bloodshed that neither side could easily escape. These southern conflicts reverberated across Anatolia. To Turkish nationalists, they were further proof that foreign occupation, no matter the flag, brought only partition and violence. To the Allies, they were an unwelcome complication, draining resources and political capital at a moment when enthusiasm for enforcing the peace was already fading. The French, in particular, began to question whether holding territory in Anatolia was worth the mounting cost in lives and legitimacy. At the same time, the political situation in Constantinople grew even more unstable. Elections held in early 1920 saw Kemalist nationalists win significant representation in the Ottoman parliament, a direct challenge to the authority of the Sultan's government. Alarmed, British authorities arrested many nationalist deputies and moved to formalize the occupation of the capital itself. What little credibility the Ottoman state retained collapsed almost overnight. For Kemal and his supporters in Ankara, these events were transformative. The violence in the south, the arrests in Constantinople, and the failure of the Allies to impose order all reinforced a single message: the old system was finished. Negotiation within the existing framework was no longer possible. The struggle for independence would have to be fought simultaneously on military, political, and moral fronts. By the spring of 1920, Anatolia was no longer simply occupied, it was fractured. Multiple wars overlapped, each feeding into the next, creating a landscape where restraint was punished and resolve rewarded. Out of that chaos, the Turkish nationalist movement drew strength, preparing itself for the decisive confrontation that would soon be written into a treaty meant to end the war, but destined instead to make it inevitable. In April 1920, after months of indecision and private bargaining, the Allied powers finally agreed on the terms of a peace treaty meant to formally end the war with the Ottoman Empire. What emerged was the Treaty of Sevres, a document that attempted to impose order on chaos by redrawing the map of Anatolia with lines that reflected Allied interests more than realities on the ground. On paper, it was comprehensive. In practice, it was dangerously detached from the balance of power unfolding across Turkey. Under the treaty, Britain secured what it valued most: international control of the Straits and guarantees for the creation of Armenian and Kurdish states, buffering imperial roots and extending influence without direct annexation. France and Italy were granted spheres of influence in Anatolia, along with extensive financial concessions designed to compensate them for wartime losses. Greece emerged as one of the treaty's apparent winners, gaining eastern Thrace outright and the right to administer Smyrna, which would formally remain part of Turkey but be governed by Greece pending a referendum after 5 years. For the Ottomans, the terms were devastating. The empire would be reduced to a shadow of its former self, its armed forces capped at 50,000 men, its navy limited to a handful of small vessels, and its air force abolished entirely. Reparations were imposed, and sovereignty was fractured by foreign control over key regions and institutions. To many Turks, Sevres was not a peace settlement, but a sentence of national dismemberment. Mustafa Kemal and the nationalist movement saw the treaty as their worst nightmare, and simultaneously as a gift. If implemented, it would mean the end of any meaningful Turkish independence. But its very severity rallied thousands more to the nationalist cause. The treaty crystallized what had previously been abstract fears into a single, undeniable threat. Opposition to Sevres became synonymous with patriotism, and resistance gained a clarity it had previously lacked. The Allies, however, lacked the means to enforce their own creation. Marshal Ferdinand Foch estimated that 27 divisions would be required to impose the treaty by force, a commitment no Allied government was willing to make after 4 years of global war. Britain, France, and the United States were exhausted, politically divided, and increasingly reluctant to send soldiers back into combat. Athens insisted that once the treaty was signed, the situation would stabilize. Trusting that Greek arms could achieve what Allied diplomacy could not, the powers gave Greece permission to expand its military operations. The Treaty of Sevres, intended to end the conflict, instead set the stage for its most violent phase, transforming diplomatic failure into open war across the Anatolian heartland. With the Treaty of Sevres signed, but unenforced, the burden of turning paper promises into reality fell squarely on Greek bayonets. On June 22, 1920, Greek forces advanced beyond their original zone of occupation, pushing north toward the Sea of Marmara, east into central Anatolia, and westward into eastern Thrace. What had once been framed as limited administration now became a full-scale military offensive, driven by the belief that speed and decisiveness could compensate for political uncertainty. At first, the advance appeared successful. Greek units captured key towns, including Edirne, Iznik, and Usak, stretching their control across wide swaths of territory. Turkish nationalist forces, still in the early stages of building a regular army, largely withdrew in a fighting retreat. Skirmishes flared along the roads and rail lines, and both sides accused the other of atrocities as villages were occupied, abandoned, or destroyed in the churn of advancing columns. Yet even as Greek troops pressed forward, unease grew among their supposed allies. French and Italian officials, increasingly skeptical of Greek ambitions, called for a halt to the advance. They feared that deeper penetration into Anatolia would provoke exactly the nationalist consolidation they hoped to avoid, turning a fragile settlement into a prolonged war. Britain wavered, offering political encouragement, but withholding the military support Athens desperately wanted. Greek leadership now faced a strategic crossroads. One option was to consolidate gains in eastern Thrace, securing territory already granted by the treaty and presenting the world with a fait accompli. The other was far riskier: drive into Anatolia to crush Mustafa Kemal's movement before it could fully organize. Military commanders favored the latter. Venizelos hesitated. He believed time might still bring British reinforcements and stronger Allied backing, and chose to pause rather than gamble everything on a decisive blow. That pause proved costly. While Greek forces waited, Turkish nationalists used the breathing space to reorganize, recruit, and prepare for the next phase of the war. By the end of 1920, the Greek army stood deep in hostile territory, its supply lines lengthening, its political support thinning, and its enemy growing stronger by the day. The initial offensive had achieved impressive territorial gains, but it had failed to deliver the one thing Greece needed most: a decisive end to the war. As the year 1920 drew to a close, the war's character began to change. The early phase, marked by occupation, irregular resistance, and improvised violence, gave way to something more dangerous: two expanding armies facing each other across the Anatolian interior. The conflict was no longer just about holding territory. It was about who could transform chaos into command. In Ankara, Mustafa Kemal and his allies focused relentlessly on building a regular army. By late 1920, the Turkish National Assembly's forces had grown to around 86,000 men, organized under a clearer chain of command and supplied with increasingly reliable logistics. Training improved, discipline tightened, and the language of resistance shifted from survival to sovereignty. For the first time, the nationalist movement looked capable of fighting a conventional war. The Greeks, meanwhile, continued to reinforce their Army of Asia Minor, which reached roughly 100,000 troops by the end of the year. On paper, the balance still favored Greece. Its soldiers were better equipped, its artillery more numerous, and its officers confident after months of advance. But beneath those advantages lay growing strain. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers from Smyrna into the interior, roads deteriorated, and the burden of occupation weighed heavily on morale. The first clear warning came in October 1920, when Turkish nationalist forces launched an offensive along the Gediz River. Though Greek troops ultimately repelled the attack, the engagement revealed something new: coordination, planning, and an enemy willing to stand and fight rather than melt away. The Gediz fighting did not change the map, but it changed perceptions. The Turkish army was no longer a collection of irregulars. It was becoming a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, Kemal opened another front in the east, moving against Armenian forces and pushing them back toward the former Russian border. The campaign was marked by widespread atrocities against civilians, deepening the region's suffering, but also securing the nationalist rear. With the eastern frontier stabilized, Ankara could concentrate more fully on the Greek threat in the west. By late 1920, momentum was no longer clearly Greek. The battlefield had become more balanced, and the war more unforgiving. What had seemed like a temporary occupation was hardening into a prolonged struggle between two national projects, each now backed by growing armies and incompatible visions of the future. The next phase would test not only military strength, but political unity, and in Greece, that unity was about to fracture at the worst possible moment. Just as the balance on the battlefield began to shift, Greece's greatest weakness revealed itself far from the front lines. The country had never fully healed from the political schism that divided it during the First World War, when loyalty to Prime Minister Venizelos clashed bitterly with support for the monarchy. By late 1920, that unresolved division resurfaced with catastrophic timing. In October 1920, King Alexander of Greece died suddenly after being bitten by a monkey in the gardens of the royal palace. The death itself was absurdly accidental, but its consequences were anything but. With no clear successor acceptable to all factions, the question of the throne reopened old wounds. Almost immediately, the fragile political consensus holding Greece together collapsed. Elections were held later that year, and to the shock of many observers, Venizelos was defeated. Exhausted by war, strained economically, and disillusioned by endless mobilization, Greek voters turned toward royalist candidates who promised peace and stability. In December 1920, the exiled King Constantine I returned to the throne, reclaiming power he had lost during the First World War. The return of Constantine was a diplomatic disaster. To the Allied powers, especially Britain and France, he was remembered as a pro-German monarch who had resisted cooperation during the war. Trust evaporated almost overnight. Loans dried up, political goodwill vanished, and Greece found itself increasingly isolated at the very moment it depended most on foreign support to sustain its campaign in Anatolia. The consequences rippled through the army. The nationalist officers were purged or sidelined, replaced by royalists whose loyalty was political rather than professional. Command continuity suffered, morale weakened, and experienced leadership was lost just as the war demanded greater coordination and discipline. Greek forces still held vast territory, but the foundation beneath them was beginning to crack. By the end of 1920, Greece faced an unforgiving paradox. Its army stood deeper in Anatolia than ever before, confronting a stronger and more organized enemy, while the political unity and international backing that had made the campaign possible were slipping away. The war was no longer just being fought against Turkish nationalists. It was being undermined from within Greece itself. At the start of 1921, the conflict entered a colder, more dangerous phase. Hope that diplomacy might rescue the situation flickered briefly, then went out. The London Conference, intended to reconcile the Treaty of Sevres with the realities on the ground, collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. The Turkish National Assembly refused to accept a settlement that left their country partitioned, while the Allies lacked the unity or resolve to impose meaningful revisions. Once again, talks ended without results, and the war returned to the battlefield. In Ankara, the nationalist movement consolidated its political foundations. The Assembly passed a new constitution, openly condemning the Sultan's government in Constantinople as illegitimate. More importantly, in March 1921, Kemal secured a treaty with Bolshevik Russia, stabilizing Turkey's eastern border and unlocking a steady flow of weapons, ammunition, and financial support. For the first time, the Nationalist army could plan its operations knowing its rear was secure. Greek forces, meanwhile, prepared for renewed offensives. Reinforcements arrived in Anatolia, pushing troop strength beyond 100,000 men, but the quality of leadership deteriorated. The Nationalist officers were systematically replaced with royalists, and General Anastasios Papoulas assumed command of the Army of Asia Minor. With new troops came troubling reports of looting, arson, and violence against Turkish civilians in occupied areas, acts that further alienated the local population and strengthened nationalist resolve. By April 1921, even Greek authorities were forced to acknowledge the problem. The Governor-General of Smyrna admitted that violence against Turkish civilians had increased sharply. International observers were far less restrained. An International Red Cross report accused elements of the Greek occupation army of participating in the extermination of Muslim populations, noting that irregular bands were not disarmed but actively assisted by regular troops. Such reports eroded what little sympathy Greece retained abroad. Violence was not one-sided. In the Pontic region, Turkish bands led by Topal Osman carried out brutal reprisals against Greek communities, killing thousands. Survivors later recalled scenes of extreme cruelty, children thrown into wells, elderly villagers burned alive in churches and barns. These atrocities, layered atop earlier trauma, deepened the war's ethnic dimension, turning it into a conflict where fear often mattered more than strategy. By mid-1921, both sides were trapped in a brutal logic. Greece believed it needed a decisive military victory to force a settlement before international support vanished entirely. Turkish nationalists believed survival itself depended on defeating the invaders in the field. Diplomacy had failed, restraint had collapsed, and the war hardened into a test of endurance that neither side could easily abandon. By early 1921, both sides understood that the next clashes would not merely decide territory, but belief. The Greek government, desperate to restore momentum and credibility, authorized new offensives aimed at breaking the nationalist army before it could fully mature. The first major test came in January 1921, near the small town of Inonu, where Greek forces advanced with confidence born of numerical and material superiority. Tactically, the Greeks achieved their immediate objectives. They pushed forward, engaged Turkish positions, and then withdrew according to plan. Yet when the smoke cleared, it was the Turkish nationalists who claimed victory. For them, Inonu was proof that their reorganized army could stand its ground against a modern force and survive. The psychological impact was enormous. Soldiers who had once doubted the viability of resistance now believed that independence could be defended with rifles, discipline, and resolve. The Greeks returned in March 1921, determined to erase that impression. The Second Battle of Inonu was larger, bloodier, and more decisive in its consequences. Once again, Greek troops made gains, but poor coordination and determined Turkish counterattacks blunted the offensive. When the Greeks pulled back, the nationalists celebrated another defensive success. The battlefield remained contested, but morale shifted unmistakably toward Ankara. For Mustafa Kemal, Inonu was a turning point. It allowed him to present the nationalist cause as legitimate not only politically, but militarily. The victories were broadcast across Anatolia as symbols of rebirth, encouraging recruitment and stiffening civilian support. Foreign observers took note as well. The idea that Turkish resistance could simply be brushed aside was no longer credible. In Athens, the meaning of Inonu was darker. Greek leaders began to sense that the war would not end quickly or cheaply. Each advance demanded greater effort, each withdrawal deeper explanation. Even officers who supported the campaign quietly questioned whether Greece had the strength to impose its will on such vast, hostile terrain. The battles of Inonu did not decide the war, but they changed its rhythm. What had once looked like a one-sided advance now resembled a grinding contest of endurance. And as both sides absorbed the lessons of morale and myth, the stage was set for an even larger confrontation, one that would test whether victory without decision could still be called victory at all. By the summer of 1921, the Greek leadership resolved to gamble once more, convinced that only a sweeping victory could end the war before political and economic collapse set in. The Army of Asia Minor had grown into a massive force, nearly 200,000 men, supported by thousands of machine guns and hundreds of artillery pieces. Opposing them, the Turkish nationalists reorganized their army under İsmet Pasha, fielding around 122,000 troops who, though outgunned, were better coordinated than ever before. In July, Greek forces launched a broad offensive aimed at encircling and destroying the Turkish army near Kutahya. Advances in both the northern and southern sectors made rapid progress. The Greeks retook Afyonkarahisar, pushed Turkish units back across the Sakarya River, and occupied the key towns of Kutahya and Eskişehir. On the map, the victory looked decisive. In Athens, officials spoke again of imminent success. But beneath the apparent triumph lay a familiar problem. The Turkish army had not been annihilated. It had withdrawn in good order. Many of the reported Turkish losses reflected units temporarily scattered rather than destroyed, men who would soon return to the ranks. The Greeks, meanwhile, paid a heavy price. Around 8,000 Greek soldiers were lost, while Turkish casualties, estimated at 30,000, masked a force that remained intact and dangerous. The advance triggered panic in Ankara. Government offices prepared to evacuate, and for a moment the survival of the nationalist movement seemed in doubt. Yet Kemal and Fevzi Pasha refused to abandon the capital. The National Assembly voted to stay, transforming Ankara from a temporary headquarters into a symbol of defiance. Survival itself became a political statement. For the Greek army, the campaign revealed its limits. The distances were vast, supply lines fragile, and the decisive blow once again elusive. Commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. Each victory pushed them deeper into hostile territory without bringing the war closer to an end. Yet retreat felt unthinkable. To withdraw now would be to admit failure after years of sacrifice. Kutahya Eskişehir thus became a paradox, a clear battlefield success that solved nothing. The Turkish army lived to fight again, morale hardened on both sides, and Greece stood at the edge of one final gamble. If victory was still possible, it would have to come not from another advance, but from breaking the enemy's will entirely. The road ahead led toward Sakarya, and with it, toward the moment when the war's outcome would finally be decided. In August 1921, the Greek leadership committed itself to one last desperate gamble. Having failed to destroy the Turkish army at Kutahya Eskişehir, Greek commanders convinced themselves that only a direct strike toward Ankara could break the nationalist movement's backbone. Even British observers were aghast. Arnold Toynbee would later describe the plan as a crazy enterprise, arguing that every rational objective had already vanished. But desperation has a way of silencing caution. The scale of the confrontation along the Sakarya River was immense. The Greeks assembled roughly 124,000 men, supported by hundreds of machine guns and nearly 300 artillery pieces. Facing them were around 100,000 Turkish soldiers, fewer guns, and thinner supply lines. But they were fighting on home ground, defending the last barrier before Ankara. The battle opened on August 13th, and at first the Greek advance made steady progress, driving the Turks back and pushing to within 50 kilometers of the nationalist capital. The danger forced Mustafa Kemal to take extraordinary measures. He persuaded the National Assembly to grant him near-dictatorial authority, arguing that the crisis demanded unity of command. With those powers, he issued his most famous order. There would be no single line of defense, only an area of defense, and that area was the entire country. Every village, ridge, and ravine would be contested, even if it meant bleeding the land itself. To sustain the fight, Kemal rushed Russian-supplied weapons to the front and requisitioned enormous quantities of food and animals from an already impoverished population. The burden was crushing, but resistance stiffened. Greek troops, meanwhile, outran their supplies as the campaign dragged on for weeks across barren, marshy terrain unsuited to modern transport. What had looked like momentum turned into exhaustion. On September 3rd, recognizing that the army could not continue, Greek commander Papoulas ordered a retreat. At that moment, Turkish cavalry struck the exposed flanks, accelerating the withdrawal and capturing thousands of prisoners. Nationalist writer Halid Edip Edivar later recalled interviewing Greek captives who spoke bitterly of being driven forward by machine guns toward a capital that always seemed just beyond the next hill. The month-long Battle of Sakarya ended not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with a grinding victory by attrition for the Turkish nationalists. The Greeks lost roughly 4,000 killed and 19,000 wounded, while Turkish losses reached 3,700 killed and 18,000 wounded. More importantly, the offensive spirit of the Greek army was broken. As historian Michael Llewellyn-Smith observed, the retreat from Sakarya marked the end of Greek hopes of imposing a settlement by force. From that point on, the question was no longer whether Turkey would survive, but how long Greece could endure what came next. The aftermath of Sakarya marked a decisive shift that could be felt far beyond the front lines. For Greece, the retreat exposed an uncomfortable truth. The war could no longer be won militarily, yet abandoning it seemed politically impossible. For the Turkish nationalists, Sakarya was proof that time was now their ally. What followed was not an immediate counterattack, but a patient tightening of the noose. In October 1921, France delivered the diplomatic blow that Greece had long feared. By signing the Treaty of Ankara with the Turkish National Assembly, Paris effectively ended its own war with the nationalists and recognized Ankara as a legitimate negotiating partner. French troops withdrew from Cilicia, leaving behind large quantities of weapons and ammunition that quickly found their way into Turkish hands. For Kemal, this was more than materiel. It was international validation, and it shattered the already fragile credibility of the Treaty of Sevres. The consequences rippled outward. The French withdrawal triggered a mass exodus of Christians from Cilicia, including more than 100,000 Armenian refugees who had returned under French protection after surviving the genocide of 1915 to 1918. Once again, civilians paid the price of diplomatic recalculation as borders shifted faster than people could flee. Throughout the winter of 1921 to 1922, the Turkish nationalists used the breathing space to rebuild deliberately. Another agreement with Bolshevik Russia secured the eastern frontier and brought fresh shipments of weapons and gold. Commanders like Refet Pasha focused on logistics, improving supply depots, transport routes, and training regimes. New assault battalions were formed, inspired partly by German stormtrooper tactics learned by Ottoman officers during the First World War. The nationalist army was becoming leaner, more flexible, and more dangerous. Greece, by contrast, was unraveling. The economy was in crisis, public morale eroded, and Allied support had dwindled to a handful of sympathetic British ministers who lacked the authority to reverse policy. Greek supply lines now stretched over 300 kilometers from Smyrna into the Anatolian interior, a logistical nightmare that left frontline units undersupplied and exhausted. In May 1922, General Papoulas resigned and was replaced by Georgios Chatsanestis, whose distant headquarters in Smyrna symbolized how disconnected command had become from reality at the front. Desperation bred recklessness. In June, Athens transferred troops from Anatolia to eastern Thrace, hoping to march on Constantinople and force the Allies to intervene. Instead, the move was blocked outright, leaving Greek forces weakened and exposed on all fronts. To the Turkish leadership, the message was unmistakable. Greece was overstretched, divided, and losing its grip. By mid-1922, the balance of momentum had fully reversed. The Turkish army was reorganized, supplied, and confident, while Greek forces clung to an extended salient around Afyon-Karahisar, vulnerable to encirclement. Kemal understood that this moment would not last forever. If Turkey was to strike, it had to be now, before Greece could regroup, and before international politics shifted again. The final act of the war was about to begin. At dawn on August 26, 1922, the Turkish Nationalist Army unleashed the blow it had been preparing for nearly a year. The Great Offensive, Büyük Taarruz, opened with a massive artillery bombardment against Greek positions around Afyon-Karahisar, followed by coordinated infantry assaults designed to rupture the exposed Greek salient. For the first time in the war, the Nationalists attacked not in desperation, but with confidence born of preparation, unity, and timing. On paper, the armies were comparable. The Turks fielded roughly 200,000 men, supported by nearly 3,000 machine guns, 323 artillery pieces, and, crucially, over 5,000 cavalry. The Greeks had around 218,000 troops, more machine guns and artillery, but only 1,300 cavalry, a critical disadvantage once their lines began to bend. The Turkish plan, devised by Mustafa Kemal and İsmet Pasha, mirrored earlier Greek ambitions: envelop the enemy, sever retreat routes, and destroy the army rather than merely push it back. Initial Greek resistance was fierce, and on the first day Turkish assaults stalled. But on August 27th, nationalist troops captured the high ground at Erikmen, turning the Greek defensive position into a trap. With Greek headquarters located hundreds of kilometers away in Smyrna, orders came too late, or not at all. Units fought bravely but blindly, unaware that the line behind them was already collapsing. Within days, formations dissolved into fragments, retreating westward under constant pressure. On September 1st, Kemal issued the order that defined the war's end. Armies, your first objective is the Mediterranean. Forward! Turkish cavalry surged through the gaps, harassing retreating columns, surrounding isolated units, and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. The once proud Army of Asia Minor ceased to exist as a coherent force. In its wake, scorched earth tactics and uncontrolled violence left villages burned and civilians displaced, adding one final layer of suffering to an already devastated land. By September 9, 1922, Turkish nationalist troops entered Smyrna. Panic gripped the city's Greek and Armenian populations, who feared revenge after years of occupation and war. Greek authorities urged civilians to remain, even as officials fled. Within days, violence erupted. The city's Orthodox archbishop was seized and murdered, and on September 13th, fires broke out in the Armenian quarter, spreading rapidly until much of Smyrna lay in ruins. Between 12,000 and 30,000 Christians were killed, while tens of thousands fled to the harbor, some rescued by Allied ships, many others drowning as they tried to escape the flames. The catastrophe shattered Greece. On September 24th, army officers led a coup in Athens. King Constantine abdicated, and former leaders, including Prime Minister Gounaris and General Chatzinestis, were executed. The war ended officially with an armistice on October 11, 1922, but its consequences rippled outward. Around 1.5 million Greeks were driven from Turkey, while the crisis nearly triggered war between Britain and Turkey during the Çanak crisis, toppling Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Peace finally came with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which replaced Sevres and recognized the borders of modern Turkey. It formalized a vast population exchange. 1.2 million Orthodox Christians moved to Greece, and 400,000 Muslims to Turkey. The Greco-Turkish War had claimed tens of thousands of lives and erased centuries-old communities, but it also marked the birth of a new Turkish republic and the final collapse of the dream of Greater Greece. What remained was not victory or defeat alone, but a reshaped Eastern Mediterranean, forged in fire, exile, and the long shadow of a war that followed another war's end.